And so we started with the title, and we wanted to think about, well, what do we know about the EU and the movements that have taken place in it, particularly since the crisis. And so we started with this idea of how can we model or how can we understand exactly why we see certain groups mobilizing in certain countries. And this comes back a little bit to that comparative analysis point that Jorg was working with and talking about yesterday. So an alternative title as I was working through this was something along the lines of what do we know about and why, or really where do we think that this idea of online, social, mobile media will cultivate or contribute to this idea of social movements, these protest movements that cropped up not just in one place and not just in one time, but in many countries across a sustained period of time. And where we also wanted to position this work was to say, can we recognize any sort of observable impact of these mass protests? And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those. And so as we continued to conceptualize and think about this, we came up with yet another alternative title, because what we were really doing is we were using some regression models to predict riots, to predict protests, to predict, those Tahrir moments, and whether they were in Madrid or whether they were in Athens or wherever they might have taken place. So again, what we wanted to do here then is to bring in the idea, which has become to be, I think, one of these variables that's a little bit underexplored, particularly in the communication discipline, but is getting some traction in political science, which has to do with this idea of disenfranchised youth and youth bulge populations, which have been used to explain to some extent some of the movements we've seen, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, but whose emergence here might play an important role. So here we wanted to try to connect the dots, if you will, and there's a certain line of thinking or a certain rationale that's become fairly prominent, particularly in the popular understanding of what media are doing and how they're contributing to things like the Arab Spring or Twitter revolutions or Occupy or Indignatios or whatever the case might be. And so when we think about this agency transforming or morphing to digital media, of course a lot has been made about the idea of these types of media being more decentralized, being more non-hierarchical, and how this in some ways has opened up spaces to retransform or to reshape political structures and interactions. And in many ways this has been celebrated. And one of the things I think that we need to consider is how is this happening, and indeed why does this matter so much? Because we seem to be at a point in history where it's not becoming the exception, but rather the rule that we're seeing people mobilize around particular ideas through these types of media platforms. So recently developed, and again, I point to some of the scholars in this room, have Homero, Devon, Tom, and others who have worked in this space to identify that social media and online media and blogs and this other sorts of user-generated content have been ways that people have engaged more in political activities. And this extends, as some of this work has shown, not only in the online environment, but also transitions to people being more active in the offline environment. And along the way also includes, of course, measures of political talk and engagement with others that might cut across, certain heterogeneous ideas. So as we continue along this line, we see, by and large, and not, of course, in every instance, but by and large, we see some reasonably positive relationships emerge. The more that people are going, online for a specific purpose, for an informational function, like reading news or engaging with certain topics, we see that we have, correlational increases to voting, to online participation. And as some of the, this research has shown, we have this idea that online participation is translating into offline participation. And again, it's not a perfectly held rule, but we are seeing some overarching positive trends that are emerging. Empirical evidence that suggests young people are the ones who are using these technologies more heavily, more intensely, and with some observable effects. So when we bring into the equation then that we may have aggrieved or disenfranchised or underempowered youth populations, we see instances where they can be the harbingers, if you will, of social and political transformation. And as we think about, the Middle East, North Africa, the Arab Spring movement, it's easy for us to piece this narrative together. But of course, we're not talking in this instance about the Arab Spring. We're not talking about Egypt or Tahrir or Tunis. We're talking about the EU. So what we want to do is to situate exactly what these youth bulges are and why they matter in this particular context. So, of course, when we think about a definitional standpoint, and this is not necessarily something that's new either. 15 to 24-year-olds have been important catalysts for political and social change, not just in the last 5 years or so, but also thinking back to the civil rights movement in the United States and other situations as well. And some other scholarship has pointed to examples of this in Chile. And there seems to be a relatively clear connection between the fact that we have these populations that are growing, and they are, over the course of history, been associated with a willingness to take risks, and also that willingness to engage in somewhat risky behavior, such as mobilizing, protesting, standing up against powers and centers of authority, has produced a certain amount of crises and disorder, which has, in some cases, affected a certain outcome or political change. One of the things that becomes really interesting, and to come back to this narrative of mobilizations and youth movements and this sort of bottom-up fertilization, is that many of these people that were between groups, that were mentioning others, and here we saw it a little bit, right? The example I picked, he was mentioning El País, he was mentioning The Guardian, and we see people who are ordinary, become a bit more extraordinary in terms of their reach in these particular spaces. And these are, not necessarily, big mass media producers, but these are individual users who are incredibly, in most cases, they have to be active, but they're not just active within a particular circle, right? They're mentioning users across many different ideological lines. And so, so this is going to bring us a bit towards the end. So if we choose to engage with this, rational actor idea, and we choose to accept this somewhat, linear conceptualization of how aggrieved youth engages with digital media and they're acting in their own interests, we can start to see that there's some good reason to accept this understanding in the Euro crisis context, at least as an explanatory mechanism for how and why people are going, to the streets. Now, whether or not they're having, much of an effect remains to be seen. But we see very clear positive relationships, between our underemployed, our disenfranchised youth, and instability, mobile phones and instability. And in general, we see some of those bigger block predictors of, a deterministic kind of action here, where we have an investment in a product and a service, and it relates positively to economic productivity. So there's some latent byproducts, if you will, both socially and economically. So the content question still is one of those that we're wrestling with. And I think in the literature, we see cases where people argue, okay, look, these are spheres where people are not engaging. They're pulling apart, they're hostile, and they're separating. There was a really nice piece, I think, in JCMC by Itai Himmelboim recently, where he showed, how these groups were coming apart. And later, I think it was picked up by Pew. And this gets to a sort of bigger question, I think, when we think about what are social media really good at, right? And we've seen some evidence that they're good at bringing people together to complain, right? They're good at bringing people together to mobilize against authority. But we've got a space here in the EU where we're not overthrowing dictators, right? We're not transforming the entire nature of the political scene. What we're talking about is an incremental readjustment or realignment of policies, and that's, for better or for worse, not so easy to get at, and it's not quite clear that that's happening, at least in this data. So nonetheless, we start to see here, the ability of our, content to support this sort of activity, and we also see that users can not only fragment but can connect, and we have the ability to identify those particular actors, and we can find those quite well.
I guess I would ask if, at least when I see a lot of the research so far on social movements that are fueled by social media, and I'd literally just finished reading a week ago Lance Bennett's new book on connective action, looking at the same sort of phenomenon. I think one of the challenges and one of the questions that a lot of scholars are still trying to wrap their head around is what is success in terms of these sort of new movements? Does success have to be regime change, or can it be, like you said, the slow change maybe of socio-political norms or policy? And so I guess I would ask if what is your thoughts on sort of a changing definition of success, and is that something that you see eventually sort of connecting, not only can we predict these movements, but can we predict the success of these movements, whatever that means?
Well, I think that's a great question, and perhaps the million-dollar question, really. Can we determine outcomes from these sorts of events? I don't really think that we have a very good handle on that, and whether that's at the very local level, or it's at the case of Tunisia versus Egypt versus Syria versus Spain, Greece. They all seem to be coming out a bit differently, right? So it's a little. I mean, as much as we'd like to be able to piece together a tight narrative, it seems, to come back to the point yesterday, it seems a bit too case-specific or country-specific, if we will. So my best answer to that is I think we need to do more as we're able, cross national sorts of comparisons to give us a framework for understanding, all right, it worked. These socially connected social movements seem to have worked here. And again, so what do we say by what works? And did they get Toyota to recall a car or something? I mean, is that working? Is that success? I mean, and so we can be kind of specific about exactly what we want our outcome to be. Do we want it to be regime change? Do we want it to be, a gradual augmentation of rights? But I think from a more maybe philosophical standpoint, and if we're thinking about political communication more broadly, if these sorts of spaces and places and connecting with Twitter and others here leads to people generally being more informed and more empowered and more active, then I think we can say that that is hopefully a win, particularly if we see some cross-fertilization and cross-cutting talk, again, like we mentioned yesterday.